The sound of the creaking bed echoed through the dimly lit room, a haunting symphony to the chaos that unfolded before me. I had always been a man who prided himself on control, on keeping my emotions in check. But tonight, that control shattered like glass beneath the weight of my disbelief. The key turned in the lock with a finality that seemed to mock me. I pushed open the door with a force that nearly broke it off its hinges, and there, in the middle of our bed, were Mary and Thomas. The sight was so jarring that it took me a moment to fully process what I was seeing. My breath caught in my throat as the scene before me became painfully clear. Mary's face was flushed with a mix of passion and guilt, her eyes wide with shock as she locked onto mine. Thomas, with his disheveled hair and a look of fear, scrambled to cover himself with the sheets. The room was thick with the scent of sweat and betrayal, and it was as if time had slowed to emphasize the depth of my horror. "Jackson." Mary's voice cracked, laden with panic. She tried to move toward me, but her movement was awkward and disjointed. Her hand reached out as if to bridge the distance between us, but I was frozen, rooted to the spot by a combination of rage and incredulity. Thomas's reaction was equally frantic. He leapt from the bed, his eyes darting around as if seeking an escape route. "Man, this isn't what it looks like," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The words were meaningless. They were just empty sounds in the face of the gut-wrenching truth that slammed into me like a tidal wave. My heart pounded in my chest, and my vision narrowed to a tunnel focused solely on the betrayal that lay before me. A primal scream tore from my lips, a raw, guttural sound that seemed to come from a place far deeper than I had ever known. It was a cry of anguish, loss, and rage, all twisted into one desperate, painful outburst. I could feel the anger searing through me, an inferno that threatened to consume everything in its path. My hands clenched into fists, and with a surge of uncontrollable fury, I lunged at Thomas. My punches landed with a brutal intensity, fueled by a mix of anguish and rage. Each blow was driven by the pain of betrayal, the betrayal that I had felt so deeply. Thomas stumbled back, his attempts to defend himself weak and desperate. Mary's screams and pleas fell on deaf ears as I continued to assault Thomas. My vision was clouded by red, my emotions a maelstrom that left me blind to everything but the need to make him feel even a fraction of the agony I was enduring. The violence seemed to go on forever, but eventually, exhaustion overcame me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pulled away, my knuckles bloodied and my heart heavy with the weight of what I had done. Thomas lay on the floor, his face a mess of bruises and blood, his breathing shallow. At that moment, the room seemed to spin, and I staggered backward, my hands trembling uncontrollably. The realization of what I had done, the violence I had unleashed, hit me with the force of a freight train. Every ounce of trust and love that I had built with Mary over the years had been obliterated, leaving nothing but a barren wasteland of shattered dreams. The silence that followed was deafening. Mary and Thomas lay there in their misery, but it was too late for any apologies or explanations. The damage was done, and it was irreparable. I stumbled out of the room, my mind reeling from the overload of emotion. My only thought was to escape, to get away from the place where my world had been irrevocably torn apart. As I slammed the front door behind me, the cold night air hit my face, a bitter reminder of the harsh reality that awaited me. I was no longer the man I had been. Everything I had believed in, everything I had worked for, had crumbled into dust. And now, all I could do was run from the nightmare that had become my life. The rage that simmered in me after that night was like a beast clawing at the walls of my sanity, demanding release. I spent the following days consumed by thoughts of vengeance, obsessing over how to make Thomas pay for the betrayal that had shattered my world. I knew I had to act swiftly, while my anger still burned hot and clear. In the solitude of my dimly lit study, I pored over my plan, sketching out every detail with a meticulousness that bordered on madness. The abandoned house on the outskirts of town had always been a grim relic of better days, and it now served as the perfect stage for my retribution. I imagined it as a haunted trap, a place where Thomas would be forced to confront not just me, but the full weight of his treachery. The house itself was a crumbling shell, its windows boarded up and its walls scarred by time. I knew its history well, it had been empty for years, a ghost of the past that no one visited. Perfect. No one would hear Thomas's screams over the howling wind and the creaking timbers. The old house loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the evening sky. I parked my car a few blocks away and approached on foot, feeling a cold shiver of anticipation and dread. Every step seemed to echo with the weight of the plan I had meticulously crafted. Tonight was the culmination of all my rage and despair, and I needed everything to be perfect. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, greeted by the familiar musty smell of decay. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. I flicked on a flashlight and began my final preparations. First, I checked the hidden cameras. I had installed them in various corners of the main rooms, aiming to capture every angle of Thomas's reaction. Each camera was carefully placed to ensure they would record his every move without being noticed. I ran a quick test, adjusting the angles and making sure the feed was clear. Satisfied, I hid the recording device in a small, inconspicuous cabinet, leaving it ready to capture the night's events. Next, I turned my attention to the traps. The old staircase had been rigged with loose steps that would give way under weight. I tested each step with a careful push, ensuring they were securely set to snap at the right moment. The noise of the creaking wood and the sudden drop of a step would be enough to send a shiver down Thomas's spine. In the corners of the living room, I placed old, rusty tools, wrenches, nails, and broken glass, strategically arranged to create an ominous and unsettling environment. The sight of these relics of neglect and disrepair would serve as a visual reminder of the danger that lurked in every shadow. I prepared the note that would serve as the bait. It was a carefully worded message, designed to lure Thomas into the house under the pretense of a confrontation. The note was written in a way that made it seem like I wanted to talk things over, to clear the air. I placed it on a dusty table in the center of the room, ensuring it would be the first thing Thomas would see upon entering. As I continued my preparations, I could almost feel the weight of Thomas's impending fear. I arranged the furniture to create a disorienting maze of shadows and corners. The dim light of a single, flickering bulb added to the sense of foreboding. The air in the house was heavy with the tension I had infused into every corner, every creak. To complete the psychological aspect of the trap, I placed several old family photographs around the house, images of a happy past, now tarnished and neglected. They were meant to evoke a sense of haunting nostalgia, to make Thomas feel the full weight of the life he had disrupted. Finally, I stood in the center of the room and surveyed my work. The house was transformed into a sinister stage, every detail carefully orchestrated to heighten Thomas's fear and uncertainty. I could almost hear his footsteps echoing through the empty halls, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he realized the extent of my wrath. As the final light dimmed and shadows danced across the walls, I took a deep breath and stepped outside. I locked the door behind me, leaving the house ready and waiting for its unwilling guest. The night was still, the only sound was the distant hum of the city as I made my way back to my car. Everything was in place. All that remained was to wait and watch as Thomas walked into the trap I had set, the culmination of my anger and my need for revenge. The house was ready to deliver the reckoning he so richly deserved. I met Greg at our usual spot, a small, dimly lit bar on the edge of town. The place was familiar, a sanctuary from the outside world where we could unwind and talk. But tonight, it wasn't the comforting glow of the neon lights or the clinking of glasses that dominated my thoughts. It was the plan I had meticulously crafted. The plan that was about to come to fruition. Greg was already seated at our regular booth when I arrived. His face lit up with a smile as he saw me, but it quickly faded when he saw the look in my eyes. I slid into the seat opposite him, feeling a mix of relief and unease. I had to tell someone, and Greg was the only person I trusted to understand. "Jackson, you look like hell," Greg remarked, his voice laced with concern. "What's going on? You've been distant lately." I took a deep breath and leaned in. My eyes locked with his. "Greg, I need to talk to you about something. It's about Mary and Thomas." Greg's brow furrowed, and he took a sip of his drink, setting it down with a deliberate slowness. "Go on," he said, his tone cautious. I told him everything, the betrayal, the plan, the trap I had set in the old house. I spoke with a cold determination, recounting every detail as if it were a thrilling story, unaware of the gravity of what I was revealing. Greg listened in silence, his expression growing more troubled with each word. When I finished, he leaned back, shaking his head. "Jackson, I understand you're hurting. What they did to you, what she did to you, it's unforgivable. But this isn't the way to handle it. I frowned, feeling a pang of irritation at his response. What do you mean? It's the perfect plan. Thomas will get what he deserves, and I'll finally be able to move on. Greg's eyes were serious, filled with a mix of empathy and apprehension. You're setting yourself up for something terrible. This isn't just about revenge, it's about crossing a line you can't come back from. What if something goes wrong? What if the police get involved? Or worse, what if Thomas doesn't react the way you expect? His words were like ice water on my fevered emotions, but I pushed them aside. I've thought of everything. I know what I'm doing. Greg's voice grew more intense, a rare display of frustration from him. Jackson, listen to me. You're letting your anger consume you. There are consequences to these actions that you haven't fully considered. You're risking everything, your future, your freedom. And for what? To hurt someone who's already betrayed you? I shook my head, dismissing his concerns. I appreciate your concern, Greg, but this is something I need to do. It's not just about hurting Thomas, it's about reclaiming control. I need to see this through. Greg's shoulders slumped, and he looked at me with a mixture of sadness and resignation. I can't stop you, Jackson. But I hope you realize what you're doing before it's too late. I stood up, feeling a surge of frustration. Thanks for the drink, Greg. I need to go. As I left the bar, I could feel Greg's worried gaze on my back. His warnings echoed in my mind, but I chose to ignore them. I was too far gone, too committed to the path I had set. The plan was in motion, and there was no turning back. The night was cool and quiet as I made my way to my car. Greg's words gnawed at the edges of my resolve, but I pushed them away. I was determined to see my plan through, no matter the cost. The clock on my nightstand ticked away the seconds with a cruel regularity, each one stretching into eternity. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to escape the relentless churn of thoughts that filled my mind. The room was dark, the only light coming from the sliver of moonlight that crept through the curtains. It was a cold, distant light, much like the detachment I felt from the world around me. Sleep was a distant hope, an elusive dream that slipped through my grasp no matter how hard I tried to hold on. My body was exhausted, but my mind was ablaze with the fire of my plans. I could see the house, the abandoned shell that was about to become the stage for my vengeance. Every detail of the trap I had set replayed in my mind like a twisted movie reel, each scene more vivid and horrifying than the last. I tried to calm myself, focusing on the rhythmic rise and fall of my breath, attempting to chase away the relentless thoughts that clouded my mind. I took deep breaths, trying to force my body into relaxation. But each inhale seemed to draw in more anxiety, each exhale carrying with it a fragment of my sanity. The plan was so close to completion. I had carefully orchestrated every detail, each one designed to elicit the maximum amount of fear and discomfort from Thomas. I could almost hear his footsteps echoing in the empty rooms, his gasps of terror as he realized the full extent of what awaited him. The thought of it consumed me, a dark and all-encompassing obsession. I shifted restlessly in bed, trying to find a comfortable position, but it was impossible. The anticipation was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. My mind raced through various scenarios, each one more chaotic and devastating than the last. I imagined Thomas's fear, his confusion, and the way his eyes would widen in horror as he navigated the house. My heart pounded with a mix of excitement and dread, my pulse quickening with every imagined detail. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of the night to come, the abandoned house, the rusty tools, the flickering lights. The images were relentless, tormenting me with the reality of what I was about to do. I could see the note I had left for Thomas, the cruel bait that would lure him into the trap. It was all so vivid, so real, that I could almost feel the weight of it pressing down on me. I sat up in bed, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for the glass of water on my nightstand. I drank it quickly, but the dryness in my throat persisted, a reminder of my anxiety. The clock continued its relentless ticking, each second stretching into an eternity as I grappled with the enormity of my actions. I tried to remind myself of the reasons behind my plan, the betrayal, the need for retribution, the desire to reclaim control. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how far I had strayed from the person I once was. The lines between justice and vengeance had blurred, leaving me teetering on the edge of a precipice I was too blind to see. The minutes ticked by, and as the first light of dawn began to seep through the curtains, I knew there was no turning back. My resolve was set, my path chosen. I was driven by a dark need for revenge that overshadowed everything else. The house was ready, the trap was set, and all that remained was for me to face the consequences of my actions. With a heavy sigh, I climbed out of bed, feeling the weight of the night's torment settling on my shoulders. I looked out the window, watching the sky slowly brighten with the promise of a new day. But for me, this day was not about renewal or hope. It was about the culmination of my darkest desires, and the cost of that reckoning was yet to be revealed. I arrived at the old house well before the time I had set for Thomas's arrival. The pre-dawn chill was biting, and my breath formed fleeting clouds in the air as I approached the front door. My hands were steady, but my heart raced with a nervous energy. I had come to ensure everything was in place, to make sure the trap was set perfectly. But as I unlocked the door and stepped inside, a sense of unease began to creep over me. The house was silent, save for the occasional groan of the settling structure. I switched on my flashlight and began a final check, walking through the rooms with a meticulous eye. Everything was just as I had left it. The hidden cameras were in place, the traps rigged, and the psychological triggers strategically positioned. It was all ready for the night's grim purpose. I made my way to the living room, where the flickering light cast long, ominous shadows. The note I had left for Thomas was still on the dusty table, exactly where I had put it. Everything seemed eerily calm, too calm. My anxiety grew as I walked through the house, my flashlight illuminating the desolate rooms. It was then that I noticed something out of place. A strange smell lingered in the air, a scent of decay and something more metallic. My stomach churned as I followed the smell, the dim beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. It led me to the basement stairs, steps I had rigged with loose boards. The sight of them now filled me with a sudden, inexplicable dread. I descended the stairs slowly, the creaking of the old wood amplifying the silence. The basement was cold and damp, filled with the eerie echo of my footsteps. My heart pounded harder with each step. As I reached the bottom, I froze. The sight before me was one I hadn't expected. There, on the cold concrete floor, lay Thomas. His body was lifeless, his face twisted in an expression of pain and fear. A pool of blood had formed around him, and the scene was far worse than anything I had imagined. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. The trap I had so carefully prepared, the elaborate plan, I had been too late. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. My thoughts were a chaotic whirlwind. How had this happened? Why was Thomas already dead? My heart raced as I tried to piece together the reality of the situation. Next to Thomas's body lay a note, its edges stained with blood. My hands trembled as I picked it up, the handwriting unmistakably Mary's. My eyes scanned the words, each sentence hitting me like a sledgehammer. Jackson, I knew you would come here tonight. I could not wait for you to carry out your plan. I had to act first. Thomas was a threat, not just to me, but to everything we had. He knew too much, and I could not let him expose us. I have seen the depths of your rage, and I knew you would come for him. I couldn't let that happen. I had to protect us both from the consequences of your vengeance. It was not just about saving myself, but about ending a cycle of violence that could have consumed us all. I am sorry, Jackson. I did what I had to do, and I hope you can someday understand why. Mary. The note felt like a heavy weight around my neck, dragging me further into the abyss of shock and disbelief. Mary had anticipated my actions and had acted out of a twisted sense of preemptive justice. Her words echoed in my mind, a cruel twist of fate that left me reeling. I sank to my knees, the full weight of what had transpired crashing down on me. My hands shook as I looked around the basement, at the scene of death that was meant for Thomas but had become the unexpected climax of my revenge. The cameras, the traps, the planning, none of it mattered now. The night had taken a turn I could never have foreseen. My thoughts raced, fragmented, and clouded by overwhelming shock. I couldn't stay here, not with Thomas dead and Mary's confession hanging in the air. I had to leave, to escape the nightmare that had become my reality. I stood up, my legs feeling unsteady as I made my way back to the stairs. The house that had been a stage for my revenge was now a place of profound despair. I left through the front door, closing it behind me with a finality that seemed to seal my fate. The night air was cold and unforgiving as I walked away from the house. My mind was a storm of confusion and anguish, and I knew the road ahead would be one of reckoning and sorrow. The revenge I had sought had come to an end, but the consequences of that pursuit were only just beginning to unfold. The early morning light barely touched the horizon as I stumbled away from the house, each step feeling like an eternity. The cold air was biting, but it did nothing to numb the searing pain in my chest. My mind was a haze of confusion and despair, struggling to grasp the enormity of what had just happened. I drove back to my apartment in a daze, the city waking him a stark contrast to the turmoil inside me. The familiar surroundings of my home now felt alien, suffocating. I staggered inside and collapsed onto the couch, the weight of the night's events crashing down on me with a force that left me breathless. I stared blankly at the walls, my mind replaying the scenes of the past few hours in an endless loop. Thomas's lifeless body, Mary's note, the house that had been my stage for revenge, all of it swirled together in a grotesque tableau of failure and futility. The very revenge I had so meticulously planned had led to a greater tragedy, and now I was left with nothing but the wreckage of my life. The realization that my quest for vengeance had led to such destruction was almost too much to bear. I had been so consumed by anger and the desire to make Thomas pay that I had ignored the possibility of losing everything that mattered. And now, in the wake of Mary's actions, I was faced with the stark truth of what my obsession had wrought. The apartment was quiet, but the silence was deafening. I sank deeper into the couch, feeling the darkness of my thoughts encroaching on every corner of my mind. The walls seemed to close in on me, a physical manifestation of the suffocating weight of my guilt and regret. Images of Mary's note kept flashing in my mind, her words, her reasoning, her cold confession. I could not escape the haunting reality that my actions had only brought more pain and devastation. The feeling of betrayal that had once fueled me now twisted into a profound sense of loss. The house, which had been a symbol of my retribution, now stood as a monument to my failure. Tears streamed down my face, an outward manifestation of the deep, aching sorrow that gripped my heart. I had lost Mary, lost Thomas, and lost myself in the process. My quest for vengeance had consumed me, leaving behind nothing but a desolate landscape of broken dreams and shattered hopes. The once clear lines of right and wrong had blurred into a chaotic mess, and I was left to confront the stark reality of my actions. I had hoped to reclaim control, to assert my power over the chaos that had upended my life, but instead, I had become ensnared in an even greater web of destruction. I stumbled to the window and looked out at the city, now bathed in the soft light of dawn. The world outside continued to turn, indifferent to the turmoil within me. I felt disconnected from everything, my past, my present, and my future. The anger and vengeance that had once driven me now seemed so distant, replaced by a deep, hollow emptiness. In the quiet of the morning, I was left with the crushing weight of my actions. The plans, the traps, the revenge, it had all led to a place of profound sorrow and regret. I could no longer see a path forward, only the remnants of a life that had been irrevocably altered by my choices. As the hours passed, the reality of my situation settled in like a heavy shroud. I had to come to terms with the fact that my pursuit of vengeance had only led to more pain and more destruction. The road ahead was uncertain, and I could only hope that, in time, I might find some semblance of redemption amidst the wreckage of my shattered life. The early afternoon light filtered through the slats in the blinds, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. I sat on the edge of my bed, the note from Mary clutched in my trembling hands. Her words had taken on a haunting clarity in the stillness of the apartment, each line a painful reminder of the turmoil I had caused. I read the note again, my eyes tracing the familiar handwriting. Mary had acted out of a twisted sense of self-preservation, a preemptive strike against the vengeance she knew was coming. Her actions, though dark and drastic, were a reflection of her fears and desperation. And now, in the quiet solitude of my room, I found myself grappling with the full weight of her confession. As I sat there, memories of my life with Mary and Thomas began to flood back. I recalled the early days of our relationship with Mary, moments of genuine happiness and love. We had shared dreams, laughter, and plans for the future. I remembered the warmth of her smile and the way her eyes would light up when she talked about our life together. Those memories were now tainted by the betrayal and pain that had unfolded. Thomas had been a part of our lives too, a friend who had become something more. His presence had been a constant, his charisma and charm masking the darker edges that I had failed to see. I thought about the conversations we had shared, the camaraderie that had seemed so genuine. It all seemed so distant now, like a mirage that had evaporated in the harsh light of reality. The guilt and regret were suffocating. I had been so blinded by my anger and desire for revenge that I had failed to see the complexities of the situation. Mary's actions, though extreme, were a response to the very anger and vengeance that I had nurtured. I had pushed her into a corner, and in her desperation, she had acted out of fear and self-preservation. I tried to piece together why Mary had felt the need to act so drastically. Had she feared that my quest for vengeance would destroy not just Thomas but everything we had built together? Did she believe that by eliminating Thomas, she could somehow salvage what was left of our relationship? Her actions seemed so extreme, but in the context of the fear and turmoil she must have felt, they began to make a twisted kind of sense. I looked around the apartment, now feeling like a prison rather than a home. The familiar surroundings were tainted by the knowledge of what had transpired. Every object, every photograph, seemed to mock my attempt at understanding. I questioned my actions and my decisions. Had I pushed Mary to this point? Had my desire for revenge been so overpowering that it led us all to this tragic end? I thought about the warning Greg had given me, his concerns about the path I was on. In hindsight, his words echoed with a painful clarity. I had been so absorbed in my sense of injustice that I had ignored the possibility of a more profound and devastating outcome. My actions had set off a chain reaction that I could not control, and now I was left with the fallout. Sitting alone in the dim light, I struggled to find some semblance of understanding. Why had things turned out this way? What had driven Mary to act so violently, and what had driven me to create a trap that led to such destruction? The answers were elusive, lost in a sea of regret and sorrow. I sank to the floor, the weight of my reflections pressing down on me. The path to redemption seemed impossible to navigate, obscured by the pain of loss and the burden of my own choices. I had sought vengeance, and in doing so, had lost everything that mattered. The road ahead was shrouded in darkness, and all I could do was confront the consequences of my actions, hoping that someday, amid the wreckage, I might find a way to forgive myself and understand the reasons behind it all. The weight of my guilt and despair was soon overshadowed by a new, more insidious fear. As I sat in my apartment, the reality of the situation began to sink in more deeply. Mary's actions had set off a chain reaction, and now, as I faced the aftermath, a chilling thought occurred to me. What if my actions were discovered? What if I was implicated in the events that had unfolded? My mind raced as I envisioned the potential consequences. The meticulous planning of the trap, the hidden cameras, the traps I had set, all of it could easily be twisted into evidence of my involvement. The fear of being accused of conspiracy or even being seen as the mastermind behind Thomas's death gnawed at me. An ever-present shadow in the corners of my mind. I paced the room, my thoughts a whirlwind of anxiety and paranoia. The idea of being investigated, of having my every move scrutinized by law enforcement, was almost too much to bear. I had taken every precaution to keep my involvement hidden, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized how precarious my situation was. The police could connect the dots, uncover the hidden details, and find a way to implicate me in the crime. My heart raced as I imagined the possible scenarios. What if someone had seen me near the house? What if forensic evidence was left behind that could link me to the scene? The thought of being questioned, of having my actions and motives laid bare, filled me with a profound sense of dread. I considered the possibility of fleeing, of disappearing to avoid any potential charges. But the very thought of abandoning everything I had known, of running from the consequences of my actions, seemed both frightening and unacceptable. How could I justify running away when I was already so deep in this mess? I sat down heavily at my desk and tried to calm my racing thoughts. I needed to think clearly, to figure out a way to protect myself while grappling with the reality of my situation. I began to piece together what I knew about the potential evidence against me. The house had been abandoned, but I had left behind clues that could tie me to the scene. The note I had found had been a critical piece of evidence. What if someone discovered it and traced it back to me? The idea of seeking legal advice crossed my mind. But the very notion of bringing a lawyer into this was fraught with complications. What would I say? How could I explain my involvement without implicating myself further? The legal system was a maze, and I was woefully unprepared to navigate its complexities on my own. I glanced at the clock and realized how much time had passed. The day was moving on, and I was still trapped in this cycle of fear and uncertainty. My actions had set off a chain of events that I couldn't control, and now I was left to confront the possibility of being caught in the web of legal and moral consequences. The more I thought about it, the more I felt the walls closing in. The fear of arrest, of being labeled as an accessory or a mastermind, became a constant, suffocating presence. The darkness of my actions seemed to loom ever larger, threatening to engulf me. As the hours ticked by, I struggled to find a sense of clarity. I needed to act quickly, but I was paralyzed by the fear of making a mistake. The very actions that had been driven by anger and a desire for revenge now seemed to threaten my freedom and my future. The reality of the legal consequences was a harsh reminder of the depth of my entanglement in this grim affair. In the solitude of my apartment, I faced the daunting prospect of a future uncertain and fraught with peril. The shadow of suspicion loomed large, and the weight of my own choices pressed down on me with a suffocating force. As the evening settled over the city, the weight of my fears and regrets grew heavier. The shadows in my apartment seemed to close in on me, the darkness reflecting the turmoil within. I had spent the day in a state of constant anxiety, wrestling with the possibility of being implicated in Thomas's death and the potential consequences of my actions. The looming threat of legal repercussions was suffocating, and I knew that I had reached a breaking point. I stood by the window, looking out at the city below. The streets were bustling with life, a stark contrast to the chaos that had engulfed my existence. The sight of the familiar skyline, the places I had once called home, now felt foreign and hostile. The city that had been my refuge now seemed like a cage, one I was desperate to escape. The realization hit me with painful clarity. The best way to avoid the potential fallout of my actions was to leave everything behind. The thought of fleeing was both terrifying and liberating. It was a drastic step, but the prospect of facing an investigation, of being accused or even convicted, was far more daunting. I had to make a choice: stay and face the consequences or disappear and try to start anew. I paced the room, my thoughts racing as I considered my options. If I were to leave, I needed to act quickly. I had to plan my departure meticulously, ensuring that I covered my tracks and made it as difficult as possible for anyone to trace me. The urgency of the situation was clear: the sooner I left, the less chance there was of being caught. I began to make preparations, starting with gathering the essentials. I packed a few changes of clothes, my identification documents, and some cash, enough to get me started in a new place but not so much that it would attract attention. I made sure to keep my departure plans discreet, knowing that any slip-up could jeopardize my chances of escaping unnoticed. As I packed, memories of my life in the city flashed through my mind. The familiar places, the people I knew, all of it would soon be behind me. I felt a pang of sorrow for the life I was leaving behind, but it was quickly overshadowed by the pressing need to secure my future. The night had grown quiet, the city's distant hum now a mere whisper as I stood in the center of what had been my life. The apartment was nearly empty, save for a few scattered remnants of my past, a collection of personal items that now seemed like relics of a different existence. I had reached the final stage of my departure, and it was time to let go completely. I had spent the day meticulously preparing for this moment. I sorted through my belongings, each item a tangible connection to the life I was leaving behind. Clothes, photographs, mementos, everything was laid out before me, a visual representation of my past. It was a strange feeling, knowing that these objects had once held so much meaning and now were destined to be discarded. In the small courtyard behind the building, I had set up a makeshift pyre. The flames crackled and danced as I tossed item after item into the fire. Each piece I threw in was accompanied by a bittersweet farewell, a goodbye to the memories, to the life I had once known. The fire's warmth was a stark contrast to the coldness that had settled in my heart, but it was a necessary step in severing ties with my past. I watched as the flames consumed the remnants of my old life, the smoke rising into the night sky. It was a cathartic ritual, one that symbolized the finality of my decision. The process was both liberating and melancholic, a poignant reminder of the life I was abandoning. Once the fire had burned down to embers, I took a deep breath and turned my attention to the letters I had written, one to Mary, one to Thomas, and one to myself. The letters were my way of finding closure, of expressing the things I had never said before. I carefully placed each letter in a sealed envelope and left them in a place where they might eventually be discovered, if anyone cared to look. They were my final act of reconciliation, a way to make peace with the ghosts of my past. With the ritual complete and the last of the remnants consumed by the fire, I packed the remaining items into the trunk of my car. The finality of my actions was both exhilarating and terrifying. The decision to leave everything behind was made, and now it was time to put it into motion. I drove away from the apartment, taking one last look at the city lights that had once been a backdrop to my life. The streets were quiet, and the familiar landmarks seemed to blur into the darkness. I felt a pang of sadness, but it was quickly overshadowed by the resolve to start anew. The past was behind me, and the road ahead was filled with uncertainty and possibility. As I crossed the city limits, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. The decision to leave had been driven by a deep need for change. For escape from the shadows of my past. I was determined to find a new path, one that would lead me to peace and purpose. My journey took me to a small, quiet town far from the city. The change of scenery was both a physical and emotional shift, marking the beginning of a new chapter in my life. I found a modest apartment and started the process of re-establishing myself under a new name, a fresh start that would help me leave my old identity behind. The town was serene, its simplicity a stark contrast to the chaos I had left behind. The slower pace of life allowed me to reflect and begin the process of healing. I sought work in a local business, hoping that the routine and stability would provide a sense of normalcy. The people I met were kind and welcoming, offering a sense of community that I desperately needed. Each day in this new place was a step toward rebuilding my life. I focused on small goals, finding solace in the simplicity of routine and the quiet moments of reflection. The journey was far from easy, but it was a journey toward redemption and self-discovery. As I settled into my new life, I found comfort in knowing that I was moving forward, away from the shadows of my past and toward a future filled with new possibilities. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope. The scars of my past would always be a part of me, but they no longer defined who I was. I was determined to forge a new path, to find peace and purpose in a life that was, at last, my own.